In this video, we'll take a closer look at the stories of black women who were sentenced to death and executed in the United States. These are cases that stand out not just because of the crimes committed, but because of who these women were, the lives they lived before the headlines, and the system that judged them. We'll explore the details of their cases, the events that led to their convictions, and the moments before their executions, stories that are as haunting as they are rarely told. On the evening of April 7, 1987, in a modest apartment in Houston, Texas, a horrific scene unfolded behind a closed door. 3 members of the same family were shot at close range. Adrian, a 23-year-old husband and father, Farah, his 7-year-old daughter, and Alton, their 21-month-old son. The killer had used a .25 caliber pistol, methodically ending each life in separate rooms, leaving behind no sign of forced entry. At first, police considered the possibility of a home invasion or drug retaliation, as Adrian reportedly had past connections to narcotics. But soon, attention turned inward to someone who had access, motive, and a chilling calm in the aftermath. That person was Frances Newton, the 21-year-old mother and wife who claimed to have discovered the bodies and called for help. Her story didn't sit right with investigators. She had recently taken out life insurance policies on her entire family, naming herself as the sole beneficiary. The gun used in the killings was traced to a man she was romantically involved with, though she claimed she had taken it only for protection. When asked why she hadn't called emergency services sooner or attempted to help, she gave vague answers. "I didn't know what to do," she told police. "Everything happened so fast." But the calmness in her voice disturbed even seasoned officers. The investigation gathered momentum quickly. Forensics confirmed that no one had broken into the apartment. Blood spatter patterns, entry wounds, and the locked front door all pointed to an insider. The insurance paperwork, filed just weeks before the murders, became a centerpiece of the case. Frances was arrested and charged with capital murder. She maintained her innocence throughout, insisting that she loved her family and that someone else must have done it. Her defense team argued that the case was circumstantial and that other suspects hadn't been fully investigated, but the prosecution painted her as calculating, manipulative, and driven by financial gain. During her trial, Newton sat largely expressionless, showing emotion only when the children's autopsy photos were shown. Witnesses spoke of her distant demeanor and her strange behavior in the days leading up to the murders. The jury took note of her inconsistencies, and the verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts, she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, her case drew national and international attention. Civil rights advocates, legal scholars, and even members of the United Nations expressed concern over the quality of her defense and the forensic evidence presented. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a woman caught in a web of assumptions, biases, and circumstantial clues? Frances Newton remained on death row for nearly 2 decades, steadfast in her denial of guilt, but appeals were denied and clemency requests ignored. On September 14, 2005, Frances Newton was executed by lethal injection. She became the first African-American woman in Texas to be put to death since the state reinstated the death penalty. Her story remains a haunting example of how quickly life, justice, and doubt can collide. Did she truly pull the trigger that night, or did the system make a mistake too final to undo? On January 2, 1988, the streets outside the Oklahoma City police station echoed with a sudden burst of violence. A single gunshot rang out, leaving 29-year-old Gloria Jean Leathers lying motionless beside her car. The shooter, standing nearby in shock and trembling, was her partner, Wanda Jean Allen. The murder happened in broad daylight, just moments after a heated argument. Witnesses were stunned. How could a domestic dispute end in such lethal finality? Police quickly took Allen into custody. Her demeanor was composed, almost eerily so. She admitted to pulling the trigger, but insisted it wasn't murder, it was fear. She claimed Leathers had threatened her life, that she had lashed out in a moment of panic, but the history between them complicated the narrative. Just 5 years earlier, Wanda had shot and killed another woman, also in a domestic dispute. Though that case had resulted in a conviction for manslaughter and a lenient sentence, prosecutors now saw a pattern. This time, they weren't seeking compromise. They wanted the ultimate punishment. As investigators pieced together the case, a portrait of Wanda Jean Allen began to emerge, one riddled with trauma, poverty, and untreated mental illness. Allen had been born into an impoverished family, diagnosed early on with brain damage from a childhood injury. Her IQ was estimated below 70. Her criminal record was sparse but pointed. Her relationship with Leathers had been passionate but volatile. Police reports from the months prior documented violent confrontations, mutual threats, and physical altercations. During the trial, Allen's defense team argued that her cognitive impairments and a history of abuse made her incapable of fully comprehending her actions, but the court didn't accept that rationale. The jury saw a woman who had killed twice, each time claiming self-defense. Prosecutors painted her as manipulative and dangerous. Her emotions in court were hard to read. She sat quietly through most of the proceedings, occasionally glancing at the photos of Gloria projected on the screen. In 1989, Wanda Jean Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her appeals lasted over a decade, gathering support from mental health advocates and death penalty opponents across the nation. They insisted she was not just a criminal, but also a product of a broken system, someone who needed treatment, not execution. Still, the state of Oklahoma refused clemency. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection. She was the first black woman to be executed in the United States in nearly half a century. As she was strapped to the gurney, she reportedly mouthed the words, "Father, forgive them." Her death reignited a national debate about mental illness, race, and justice. Had she truly been beyond saving, or had the system failed to understand her long before she ever pulled the trigger? On the night of March 4, 1995, in New Orleans East, something unfathomable happened inside a small Vietnamese restaurant. It was closing time, and the remaining staff were cleaning up when a familiar figure stepped inside. Antoinette Frank, an off-duty police officer known to the workers, entered quietly. She had been there earlier that evening, twice, asking for leftover food. But this time, she wasn't alone. Her companion, Rogers Lacaze, hovered in the shadows. Within minutes, the restaurant turned into a crime scene. Ronald A. Williams II, a fellow officer working security that night, was gunned down. Moments later, two young siblings, 17-year-old Cuong Vu and 24-year-old Ha Vu, were also murdered in cold blood. The motive seemed almost surreal: money, allegedly hidden in a microwave, and the twisted idea that their deaths would leave no witnesses. When investigators arrived, they found chaos and horror. Ronald's body was riddled with bullets. The Vu children had been executed in the back of the restaurant. Hidden inside a walk-in cooler, their sister, Chow Vu, had witnessed much of the attack through a small crack in the door. Trembling and traumatized, she would later testify that it was Frank, someone she trusted, who had ushered them into the kitchen and returned minutes later with a gun in her hand. Frank's arrest shocked the city. She had been a symbol of protection, a black woman in uniform who had risen above poverty and family instability to join the force. But her past soon unraveled under scrutiny. Antoinette had faked portions of her police application, and fellow officers had expressed concerns about her erratic behavior and questionable judgment. Her relationship with Lacaze, a teenager with a criminal record, was particularly alarming. It blurred the line between officer and offender. During the trial, prosecutors methodically detailed her betrayal. They showed how Frank used her badge and authority to lull the victims into a false sense of security before orchestrating their execution. The defense tried to shift blame to Lacaze, suggesting she had been manipulated, but eyewitness accounts, ballistic evidence, and her own shifting statements made the jury's task straightforward. Frank sat stone-faced in court, her expression unreadable, but those who knew her said she had once been a bright, driven woman, haunted by abandonment, raised in a home where love was conditional and fear ever present. Could that pain have curdled into something darker? Could her desperate need for control and validation have pushed her beyond the point of no return? In September 1995, Antoinette Frank was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Rogers Lacaze was also sentenced to death in a separate trial. Frank is currently on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel. To this day, she remains a symbol of profound betrayal, not just of 3 innocent lives, but of the public trust placed in the uniform she wore. On the morning of June 3, 1993, 43-year-old Marilyn Sage Meager was found brutally murdered in her Houston apartment. The scene was one of cruelty and chaos. Signs of a struggle, blood on the carpet, and a home ransacked. Her car was gone. The motive appeared obvious: robbery. But the brutality of the attack left detectives searching for more than just material answers. This wasn't just theft, it was deeply personal violence. The trail led quickly to two suspects, James Dickerson and 19-year-old Erica Yvonne Shepard. A witness had seen the pair lurking near the apartment complex. Police later discovered Marilyn's stolen Mazda 626 abandoned, its interior bearing fingerprints, Erica's fingerprints. When Shepard was arrested days later, she confessed to being present during the crime, but denied delivering the fatal blows. According to her, it was Dickerson who stabbed Marilyn 5 times and smashed her skull with a heavy sculpture while she watched, paralyzed by fear. But the law saw no bystander. Erica had not stopped it. She had helped plan the robbery, participated in the break-in, and assisted in tying up Marilyn before the attack escalated. She had taken the woman's keys. She had fled, and though her hands may not have held the murder weapon, her actions had unlocked the door to death. Erica's trial was swift and unforgiving. Her public defenders were inexperienced and overwhelmed. Key mitigating evidence about her background, her trauma, her abusive upbringing was barely presented. Shepard had grown up in a world of violence and poverty, where love was inconsistent and survival meant silence. She was a teenage mother by 16, and her sense of self-worth had long been eroded. But none of this found its way into the courtroom narrative. Instead, prosecutors portrayed her as cunning and heartless, a young woman who played victim to hide her role in murder. During sentencing, Erica remained quiet. She expressed no outrage, no tears. But those who visited her on death row described someone different, a woman who carried shame like a second skin, who repeated over and over that she had never meant for anyone to die. She talked about her daughter, about faith, about how fear had made her silent when it mattered most. In 1995, Erica Yvonne Shepard was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Since then, she has spent decades in isolation at the Mountain View Unit in Texas, one of the very few women on death row in the state. Advocates have since pointed to the failures of her defense, to her youth and the trauma she carried, arguing she deserved a second chance. But the family of Marilyn Meager has remained steadfast. Justice, they say, was served. Now, Shepard awaits execution with no clear date in sight. Her case stands as a complicated chapter in death penalty history, a story of guilt, yes, but also of a young woman whose silence sealed another's fate, and her own. On a scorching July afternoon in 2004, emergency responders were dispatched to a modest apartment in Arlington, Texas. Inside, they discovered the lifeless body of 9-year-old Devonte Williams. He was emaciated to the point of looking half his age, weighing only 36 pounds. His body was riddled with more than 250 scars, bruises, and lacerations, both fresh and old. His arms and legs had been bound with shoelaces. Devonte had not died suddenly. He had been slowly deteriorating, locked away from the world, starving to death in the confines of his own home. As investigators began to piece together the circumstances of Devonte's death, the story that unfolded was one of sustained neglect and hidden abuse. He had not been to school in months. Neighbors rarely saw him. When questioned, his mother Marcella Williams and her partner Lisa Ann Coleman gave inconsistent and vague answers. They claimed the boy had been sick, that he had behavioral problems, that they had been trying to discipline him, but nothing they said accounted for the overwhelming evidence of prolonged suffering. Police discovered that Devonte had been kept confined in a pantry for long periods of time. Food was withheld as punishment. The wounds on his body, including marks from restraints and signs of repeated trauma, revealed a methodical pattern of maltreatment. While Marcella was his biological mother, Lisa appeared to have taken over as the dominant force in the household. Her presence loomed large over the boy's existence. According to witnesses, she dictated the rules, enforced the punishments, and increasingly isolated Devante from any source of safety or support. During the investigation, it became clear that the household had been in turmoil long before Devante's death. Child Protective Services had previously been involved with the family, but the boy had always been returned. Reports of abuse had been closed or unresolved. Lisa Ann Coleman had a history of criminal charges, including previous child endangerment. Despite these red flags, there had been no effective intervention. The trial that followed was harrowing. Prosecutors presented graphic autopsy photos and expert testimony that described the boy's final months in excruciating detail. The jury heard how he suffered from pneumonia, dehydration, and malnutrition. He had been reduced to a shell of a child, deprived not only of food but of human care and affection. Coleman's defense acknowledged the abuse, but argued that she was not solely responsible. They pointed to Marcelo's role and painted Lisa as someone who had herself endured years of trauma, claiming she was emotionally ill-equipped to raise a child. Despite the defense's attempts, the jury saw the overwhelming control Lisa had exerted in the household. Her influence over Marcella, the severity of Devante's injuries, and her failure to seek medical help sealed her fate. Marcella had already accepted a plea deal for life in prison. Coleman stood trial alone, facing the full weight of the state's case against her. Lisa Ann Coleman was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. Throughout her time on death row, she expressed a mix of resignation and reflection. In personal letters, she spoke about the pain she carried and the mistakes she had made. She admitted to being hardened by her own upbringing, having grown up surrounded by abuse and instability. Yet, even as she acknowledged her actions, she mourned Devante and wrote about the boy he could have been. Her execution was carried out on July 9, 2014. She became the 9th woman executed by the state of Texas since the 1800s. Her death prompted intense debate. Critics questioned whether the death penalty was an appropriate response in a case so entangled with cycles of poverty, trauma, and systemic failure. Others argued that justice had been served for a child whose suffering had gone unseen for too long. Devante Williams was buried beneath a headstone that read simply, "Loved always." The simplicity of those words stands in stark contrast to the complexity of his life and the tragedy of his death. The story of Lisa Ann Coleman remains a haunting reminder of what can happen when violence becomes invisible, when cries for help go unanswered, and when systems meant to protect instead stand by and watch. On July 21, 1997, in the quiet suburb of Lancaster, Texas, 71-year-old retired psychology professor Dorothy Booth opened her front door to a familiar face. Kimberly McCarthy, her neighbor's daughter, stood outside holding a small container. She asked if she could borrow some sugar. Dorothy, ever gracious, let her in. Less than an hour later, she was dead, stabbed multiple times with a butcher knife. Her finger had been severed to remove her diamond wedding ring. Her purse and car were missing. Her body lay crumpled on the floor. When police discovered her the next day, the scene was both savage and personal. There were signs of a struggle, blood smeared across the kitchen. Nothing about it looked professional. It was desperate, frenzied. Suspicion quickly turned to Kimberly McCarthy. She had a history of drug abuse and prior convictions for theft. Booth's stolen credit cards had been used shortly after the murder to buy drugs and liquor. McCarthy was arrested the same week. She confessed during questioning, though inconsistently. At times, she said she was high and couldn't remember. At others, she blamed someone else. But forensic evidence tied her to the scene. Booth's blood was on her clothes. Her fingerprints were on the knife. The ring had been pawned. Yet even in the face of damning evidence, the story behind the crime was more complicated than it first appeared. Kimberly had once been a licensed occupational therapist. She had a degree. She had been married to a respected judge. But years of crack cocaine addiction had eroded every part of her life. By the time she killed Dorothy Booth, she was homeless, broke, and lost. She would later say, "I didn't walk in to kill her. I walked in to find kindness and walked out a murderer." At trial, prosecutors focused on the cruelty of the act, the number of stab wounds, the mutilation of the body, the theft. But the defense tried to tell the story of the woman behind the crime, a story of trauma, addiction, and mental unraveling. They asked for mercy, arguing that life in prison would serve justice. The jury disagreed. In 1998, McCarthy was sentenced to death. Her appeals stretched for more than a decade. In the meantime, 2 other unsolved murders from the early 1000s, 980, as both elderly women, stabbed and robbed, were linked to her through DNA and circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors called her a serial predator. But even then, many questioned whether the death penalty was right for a woman so clearly shattered by addiction and mental illness. On June 26, 2013, Kimberly LaGale McCarthy was executed by lethal injection. She became the 500th person executed by the state of Texas since the resumption of capital punishment in 1982. Her final words were brief: "This is not a loss, this is a victory. You know where I'm going." The woman who once borrowed sugar in search of comfort had found only devastation in her life, in her victims, and in her own final reckoning. On the night of May 9, 1989, in the quiet rural stretches of Alabama, a deputy sheriff named Jerry Harris was found shot dead in his bedroom. The initial impression of the crime scene suggested a chaotic home invasion. Drawers were pulled open, various items scattered across the floors, and a lock had been damaged. At first glance, it appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. But investigators soon noticed details that clashed with this narrative. The front door had been left unlocked, there was no sign of forced entry, and none of the valuables, including Jerry's service weapon and wallet, had been taken. Instead, the officer's body lay undisturbed on the floor, a single gunshot wound to the head. The only person present in the home that night was his wife, Louise Harris. Louise told police she had returned from the store and found Jerry already dead. Her initial behavior seemed consistent with someone in shock. She cried, spoke softly, and claimed Jerry had enemies within the department and the community. She pointed to work stress, implying that his position may have made him a target. However, as detectives probed deeper, they began to feel that something was off. Louise's timeline of events shifted slightly with each retelling. Her demeanor, while outwardly emotional, lacked the rawness investigators often observed in newly widowed spouses. The case took a dramatic turn when a local man came forward, revealing that Louise had approached him months earlier and offered money to kill her husband. He claimed he declined, but he believed she might have sought help elsewhere. His account sparked a new direction in the investigation. Phone records uncovered a series of late-night calls made by Louise to unfamiliar numbers. Financial records showed she had withdrawn significant sums of money in the weeks leading up to Jerry's death. Slowly, a portrait of premeditation began to emerge. Prosecutors would later argue that Louise had grown weary of life under Jerry's thumb and saw murder as a route to both financial independence and emotional freedom. Further digging revealed long-standing marital issues. Friends of the couple spoke of frequent arguments. Some described Jerry as strict and unyielding, both in uniform and at home. Others noted that Louise had seemed increasingly distant in the months before the shooting. Still, none had suspected she might resort to violence. At trial, the prosecution detailed a calculated scheme. They alleged that Louise had staged the robbery herself to throw off suspicion, hiring someone else to commit the murder while distancing herself from the act. Her defense countered that the man who came forward was trying to save himself from unrelated charges and had fabricated the story. They argued that the circumstantial evidence, cash withdrawals, phone calls, and hearsay, did not amount to proof of murder. Louise testified briefly, maintaining her innocence. Her statement was subdued and controlled, offering little insight into her thoughts or feelings. The jury, however, was unconvinced. They took less than a full day to find her guilty of capital murder. Louise Harris was sentenced to death in 1990. Her face remained expressionless as the verdict was announced, but observers noted how tightly she gripped the edge of the defense table. Over the years, her attorneys pursued every avenue of appeal, challenging the sufficiency of the evidence and the fairness of the trial. In 1995, the case reached the United States Supreme Court, where the argument centered on whether the death penalty had been imposed disproportionately. The court ultimately upheld the conviction and sentence. Since then, Louise Harris has lived in near-tame silence on Alabama's death row, one of the very few women in the state ever to face execution. Public statements from her have been rare, though in a brief interview years later she admitted to a sense of erasure, describing prison life as a gradual loss of identity. Whether her silence stems from guilt, trauma, or resignation remains unknown. To the law enforcement community that had once counted Jerry Harris among its own, the crime was a profound betrayal. Not only was a colleague murdered, but the crime was believed to have been committed by the person he trusted most. To them, justice was not just a matter of retribution, but of restoring dignity to a fallen officer whose final moments were overshadowed by manipulation and deceit. In the early hours of March 24, 2010, in the quiet backwoods of Pensacola, Florida, a fire flickered in the dark, a blaze that began not with gasoline, but with rage. Moments earlier, 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman had been dragged from a car, beaten with fists, tased until she could no longer scream, and doused with gasoline. Her attackers, Tina Lasagna Brown, her daughter Brittany Miller, and a neighbor, Heather Lee. As flames consumed the girl's body, the three women stood and watched. Then they left her to die alone in the woods. The brutality of the attack shocked even seasoned investigators. Zimmerman had burns on more than 60% of her body, yet somehow she survived long enough to run, half-naked, scorched, and broken, to a nearby house where she collapsed on the porch. She gasped to the homeowners, "Help me, I've been set on fire." The horror of what she endured was matched only by her will to live. She fought for 2 agonizing weeks in a Mobile hospital before finally succumbing to her injuries. The investigation unraveled quickly. Brown, Miller, and Lee were arrested within days. Their motive? Audriana had allegedly been involved in a relationship with Tina's boyfriend. What began as a confrontation spiraled into premeditated torture. Prosecutors would later describe the act as a lynching in slow motion. Interviews revealed that Brown had orchestrated the attack. She had driven the car, she had brought the gas, she had encouraged her daughter and neighbor to teach her a lesson. In court, Tina Brown sat motionless, her features sharp and cold. But beneath the surface was a woman torn apart by betrayal, not just from a girl she saw as a threat, but by a life that had repeatedly betrayed her. Raised in poverty, shaped by trauma, and failed by education, Tina had grown up learning that control was protection and pain was power. But the court was not interested in the path that led her there. It was focused only on where it ended. Witnesses recounted Audriana's last days, her swollen lips, her inability to move, her whispered questions. Why did they do this to me? Medical staff wept on the stand. Even jurors struggled to maintain composure. The jury had no doubt this was not a crime of passion. It was calculated, deliberate, and unforgivable. In 2012, Tina Lasagna Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her daughter, Brittany Miller, received life without parole. Heather Lee, who testified against them, was sentenced to 25 years. Brown's appeals have moved slowly through the courts. In a rare interview, she once said, "I lost everything. My mind, my child, and that girl, she lost her life. I can't change it, but I still ask God to make it stop burning." Brown remains on death row at Lowell Correctional Institution. Her name is etched into Florida's history not just as a killer, but as a symbol of how jealousy, untreated trauma, and generational violence can culminate in one single, inescapable inferno. On May 16, 2001, a frantic 911 call from Houston, Texas, reported a horrifying discovery. 25-year-old Joanna Rodriguez had been found bound, gagged, and suffocated inside the trunk of a car. She was wrapped in duct tape, her hands tied behind her back. Next to her was her newborn son, alive but barely breathing. The baby, found dehydrated but unharmed, would survive. His mother would not. At first, the crime looked like a targeted kidnapping gone tragically wrong. Joanna had recently given birth, and her son's presence in the trunk suggested a chilling motive. Investigators worked quickly, retracing Joanna's final hours. Witness accounts led them to an unlikely suspect, Linda Carty, a 43-year-old former schoolteacher, British citizen, and mother. What followed stunned even the most experienced detectives. According to prosecutors, Carty orchestrated the kidnapping with the help of 3 accomplices, convincing them that Joanna was a drug mule whose baby she wanted to steal. Carty allegedly told the men that she was a DEA agent conducting an undercover operation. The truth, they said, was far more disturbing. Linda had recently suffered a miscarriage or faked a pregnancy, accounts vary, and was desperate to present a newborn to her estranged partner to save their relationship. As investigators dug deeper, damning details emerged. Carty's car was seen near the scene. Her phone records connected her to the kidnappers. The men arrested alongside her confessed, pointing to Linda as the mastermind. They claimed she promised them money and protection if they helped abduct Joanna and take the child. And in Linda's own home, baby supplies were found neatly prepared. Diapers, bottles, blankets. The message was clear. She had been expecting a child that wasn't hers. But Linda Carty told a different story. She insisted she had been framed by the real kidnappers, men with criminal records, who, according to her, turned on her to save themselves. She said she was innocent, that she had nothing to do with Joanna's death. Her British citizenship brought international attention to the case. Her attorneys argued that she had been poorly represented at trial. Her court-appointed lawyer failed to call a single witness on her behalf, including people who could have potentially testified to her character and innocence. The trial moved swiftly. Prosecutors built a narrative of obsession and deceit. They showed that Carty had posed as a federal agent before, that she had lied to others about being pregnant, that she had motive, opportunity, and a twisted plan. The defense struggled to counter such a vivid story, and when the verdict came, it was as expected: guilty of capital murder. The jury sentenced her to death. Rita Carty remains on Texas death row, one of the few women there and the only British citizen. Over the years, her case has drawn attention from human rights groups, British officials, and legal reform advocates. Many argue that her conviction was flawed, that she was scapegoated, and that she never had a fair chance. Yet the Rodriguez family maintains that justice was done, that the woman who tried to steal a life in order to replace her own pain must face the consequences. In letters from prison, Carty often speaks of God, of redemption, and of the child who now lives without a mother. "I never wanted anyone to die," she wrote, "but sometimes, in the eyes of the law, wanting is no longer enough to save you." On April 12, 1989, 17-year-old Sabrina Butler arrived at a Mississippi hospital clutching the unresponsive body of her 9-month-old son, Walter. The infant showed no signs of life. His skin had gone pale, his limbs limp, and his chest failed to rise with breath. Sabrina's arrival was chaotic, a mixture of screaming pleas for help and the mechanical precision of emergency responders attempting resuscitation. But it was already too late. Walter was pronounced dead upon arrival, and from that moment on, Sabrina's life would spiral into a nightmare she never could have imagined. The initial medical assessment of Walter's body revealed bruises and marks. Some were on his chest, others on his abdomen, and a few around his ribs. Medical personnel began to question the consistency of these injuries with Sabrina's explanation. In the rush of confusion, her statements about the timeline and circumstances varied. She had mentioned trying to revive him with CPR, suggested that he had been ill in recent days, and gave inconsistent accounts of how long he had stopped breathing. These shifts, interpreted not as grief-stricken panic, but as signs of guilt, drew suspicion. Within a day, hospital staff alerted law enforcement. The investigation turned quickly toward criminality. Sabrina, still in shock, was taken into custody. She was interrogated for hours without legal counsel or family support. Under emotional pressure, sleep deprivation, and the trauma of losing her child, she signed a statement. In it, she acknowledged that she had struck Walter during a moment of frustration, when he wouldn't stop crying. The investigators framed this as a confession to fatal abuse, but Sabrina later clarified that she thought she was explaining her attempts to revive him and expressing remorse for not doing more, not confessing to murder. The authorities interpreted it differently. Their decision was swift. Sabrina was charged with capital murder. Her trial moved quickly, shaped by a narrative that painted her as violent, detached, and indifferent. Prosecutors relied heavily on her conflicting accounts and the visible bruises, arguing that only abuse could explain the injuries. They highlighted her youth as irresponsibility, her panic as deception. Her defense team lacked the resources to mount a comprehensive case. No pediatric specialists were called to testify. No trauma experts were consulted. There was no forensic re-examination of the injuries from an alternative perspective. The defense failed to argue that the bruises could have resulted from resuscitation attempts or an undiagnosed medical condition. Without context or support, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Sabrina Butler, at just 18 years old, was sentenced to death. Prison was isolating and brutal. She was housed in solitary confinement on death row, surrounded by concrete walls and constant surveillance. Her reputation as a child killer preceded her. She was shunned, threatened, and left to grieve in silence. The psychological toll was immense. She battled depression, anxiety, and loneliness. The grief of losing her son was amplified by the injustice of being punished for his death. Yet she held on to something. A stubborn belief that truth still mattered. After several years of legal battles, a federal appeal court ordered a re-examination of the case. New attorneys took up her cause. They uncovered critical gaps in the original investigation and found new forensic experts willing to testify. These experts reviewed Walter's autopsy and concluded that he had likely died from a hereditary kidney disorder, one that could have caused internal bleeding and contributed to the apparent bruising. They also testified that the marks on his body were consistent with vigorous CPR, not physical abuse. This new information dismantled the prosecution's original theory. In 1995, 6 years after she was convicted, Sabrina's verdict was overturned. At her retrial, the narrative changed entirely. The court finally heard about the panic, the inexperience, and the desperate attempts of a teenage mother trying to save her child's life. The forensic findings that were absent the first time now took center stage. Jurors were given a full picture, and within less than an hour, they acquitted her of all charges. Sabrina Butler was exonerated and released from prison. Freedom did not erase the damage. She emerged from death row to a world that had already condemned her. Strangers still whispered. Trust was fragile. She carried the trauma of wrongful conviction and the enduring ache of her son's death. Over time, she found her voice and began speaking publicly about her experience. She became an advocate against wrongful convictions and the use of the death penalty, particularly for young people and marginalized communities. Her story stands as a rare but powerful case of exoneration, a reminder that justice, when rushed, can cost not just years but lives. Sabrina Butler remains the only American woman ever exonerated from death row. Her journey from grieving teen to accused killer to survivor of the justice system is a sobering testament to how fragile truth becomes under pressure, and how vital it is to question the narratives we too easily accept. These stories are not easy to tell. They are filled with grief, violence, silence, and the irreversible finality of death. Behind every case was a real woman, living in a real world, making choices, some out of fear, some out of control, some out of desperation. They left behind questions that can't always be answered, and pain that can't always be healed. No matter how different their paths were, they all reached the same end: a prison cell, a sentence, a date no one could take back. And somewhere, always, the memory of someone who never got to grow up, grow old, or be remembered for anything other than what happened on the worst day of their life.